Behind me is the output of 8 horses kept in stables, collected together. It's going to be spread on the land in the late autumn. It's going to actually be useful as a fertilizer. Medieval people did exactly the same. They collected animal manure and piled it up, let it rot, let it compost, and spread it on the land as well. But they also kept collections of human dung, faeces, and urine too. Piss, whatever you want to call it. There are quite a few words to describe human bodily waste. But those two were essential medieval raw materials. Nothing was thrown away if it could possibly be avoided. It was all put back into use after a while. Let's put the wheelbarrow away and let's go and talk about it. In the medieval period, human waste, solids and liquids, faeces, urine, were considered, I think, as very, very different products. They weren't just things that you flushed down the toilet and sent via pipes to the municipal authorities. They were gathered separately. Your solids would go into a cesspit, and those would be emptied out by gong farmers, by specialist diggers, whose job it was to empty to empty private cesspits. And the fluids were collected by a man who walked along the street with a barrel on a wheelbarrow, probably. The piss man. It's very likely that there was a man that came along and shouted, "Piss, piss," and people would come out with their chamber pots first thing in the morning. That probably only happened in towns and cities though, and there's very little reference to it, although there are some statutes that say you have to give your urine to, you can't throw it in the street. So they're sort of, and it's not really something that people write about very often, but I have a suspicion that because it was valuable, because urine was very valuable, it was collected separately, that there was a specific job. It wasn't probably much sought after, but I think in towns and cities there would have been men, probably several men, going around with wheelbarrows and barrels on them and having that filled up with people's chamber pots. First thing in the morning, piss, piss, whatever he shouted. I don't know, what would he shout? What would you shout if you didn't want to be too rude to say that you were coming to collect people's urine? Don't know. If you've got any ideas, let me know. I know that sometimes the shout, though, of people that are selling things is almost it's quite hard to understand. I had an experience once as a boy in Leicestershire. I saw a rag and bone man going past. He had an old horse and he had a cart, flatbed cart on rubber wheels, and it had lots of things on the back of it. And he was effectively a private garbage collector. He would take things if he thought there was any value to them. And as he walked along, he'd shout, "Ragbone, ragbone, ragbone," to alert people to his presence. He just kept going until somebody came out of the house. I watched several people come out of the house with bags of things, and he'd have a look and he'd maybe hand over some money and he'd take whatever it was and presumably recycle it, sell it, process it in some way. I don't think that happens anymore because that was many decades ago. But I thought the way he shouted it was very interesting. It was quite a loud shout, and he shouted "Ragbone," and it wasn't rag and bone. It was a sort of compression of it. So I wonder if the piss man shouted, I don't know, what do we shout? Piss here, pisser, pisser, or something as he walked along. I don't know. But I like to imagine that the mornings in a medieval town or city were quite busy with toings and froings. There were a lot of things happening. People were going to market, people were bringing things, people were moving things around, and people were coming out with chamber pots. You weren't allowed to throw them in the street. There were very strong rules about that, and you'd get told off or fined quite badly. So you empty your chamber pot into the barrel of the piss man that comes past. What a job, hey? What a job. But a very necessary one. We all think of waste as going somewhere else, but it's a big industry. Yeah, human waste has to be processed if it's going to be used safely. And it wasn't processed in the medieval period. It was a raw ingredient for quite a few industries. Human dung, faeces, would have been collected from cesspits. Each house had its own cesspit, and that would probably just be filled up over a year, perhaps. I don't know how often it would need to be emptied, but I guess it depends on the size of the family and the size of the cesspit. But these were called night soil men, and they were weren't exactly outcasts at all, but they had to do their job after dark, generally speaking. They were the sort of hidden face of municipal waste clearance. They were quite well paid. They became known as Gong farmers, and the human manure was originally put onto municipal dung heaps. There's a statute from Coventry which talks about the human dung and certain amounts of animal dung as well, having to go out to one of the 3 municipal dung heaps outside Coventry, the walls of the town. And I like to think each one would have had a small team of managers, perhaps. There was a supervisor of the municipal dung heap, which is a fun job to think about. Somebody who supervised where the dung was put. And I presume it needed to be put into specific areas because it has to mature or rot down or compost before it can be reused and spread on the fields. Now, human dung, of course, faeces, is collected today and treated in sewage treatment plants, and it creates a sludge, a material known as sludge. Sometimes it's also dried into what's euphemistically called cake. It's just not the right use of the word cake, in my opinion, but it's a sort of dried, pelleted material. It's sold to farmers, and there are controls about how it's spread on the land. So you can't, for example, squirt sludge, the fluid stuff, onto the land if it's going to be grown, if it's going to be used for growing human food that season. I think there are rules about what can be grown when and for how long. And also there are these days, sadly, quite a lot of chemical contaminants in human waste like that. Lots of different drugs that go onto the land and aren't processed in the normal way. So it's not, a lot of people don't actually want to use it. So it's a real problem for modern society. We've got huge populations now and everybody flushes their waste away, and it's got to be put somewhere. I think some of it is burnt, but an awful lot of it is squirted onto the land or injected into the land or sprayed onto it and then ploughed in as well. So it does add nutrients, but these days I think it adds a certain amount of heavy metals and substances which you don't really want on land that's used for growing food. I think it's used more for grassland than growing lettuce, for example. But back in the day, it was very much used for farmers. I don't know whether they paid to access the municipal dung heap or whether they would be paid to cart it away, because it's obviously got to be manhandled, it's got to be literally shoveled into a cart and taken to somebody's farm and then spread off the back of a cart across the land, usually in the winter when the ground has done all of its it's frozen. Actually, often dung is spread when it's frozen, not always, but you need it to be not growing really. It needs to sort of rot into the land and be processed. It was often spread on the fallow land as well, and animals would be penned in on the fallow field. Remember the 3-field rotation system once over 3 years, so you'd have legumes and then you'd have corn and then you'd have fallow. So you'd always have a fallow field. That was used to graze livestock, but also sometimes would have the manure spread onto it because it's going to be ploughed up next year, and that would all sort of seep into the ground and be used and to maintain the fertility of the landscape. So I wonder whether the municipal dung heap actually paid people to take it away. I think that's more likely, but maybe not. Maybe there's some kind of deal done. But of course, later on, human manure, human dung becomes useful for gunpowder making. So the Gong farmers actually became very, very powerful and had their own quite wealthy guild in the high and mostly late medieval period, of course, because gunpowder comes in the late medieval. Another job that a lot of people don't know about is the use of dog manure in particular for tanning. Early on a medieval morning, just as sun is coming up, you would see carters going backwards and forwards, people doing the morning rounds. You also might see small boys gathering dog manure. Now, this isn't necessarily to do with tidying the streets, although I suppose it served that purpose. But these were often the apprentices, the youngest apprentices from tanneries. They would be sent out with a sack, I presume, possibly barefooted, possibly with no gloves, of course, or anything like that. Maybe with a little scoop. I don't know, maybe they used their hands. But their job was to go to choice places and collect the dog muck first thing in the morning, and then take it back to the tanneries where it was turned into a slurry and used for, I think it was used for taking the hair off or softening the leather itself. I think lime was used to take the hair off first, a lime bath was used first, and then I think the dog muck slurry, the bait as it was called, was used to actually tan the leather, and of course it stank very strongly. Modern tanneries stink as well. If anybody's driven past one, you wonder what that horrendous pong is. That's the tanneries. It's the same materials used, and there's not much you can do. You've got to keep it downwind. Of course, these pure boys were hopefully going to grow up to be tanners themselves, but the first job was going through the streets looking for dog muck. Now, I think it's likely there were key places where the best dog muck would be found, and I wonder if there were childhood competitions for who could fill their sack the fastest. Knowing kids, I think that's quite likely. And it's said that butchers' yards were particularly sought after because butchers' dogs get fed a lot more meat and offal than ordinary dogs, and of course they poo it out and leave it, and maybe butchers allowed the pure boys to come in to their yards to clean the dog muck up. Pretty horrendous thought, but it would have been a perfectly normal situation in towns and cities where tanneries were important. Now, of course, tanneries are very, very valuable in that they produce a raw material that's used for all sorts of things. Armour, for example, horse armour, and what's called cuir brûlé, which is a form of, it's called boiled leather, but I'm not sure it's boiled. I think it's more likely soaked in waxes and resins, potentially. Often used for horse harness, as it creates a very stiff fiberglass-like material, which isn't arrow-proof, but it's certainly going to take some battering to get through it, so it protects the sides of a horse. So I think that kind of leather armour was more specifically used for horses than for people. Now, leather, of course, is the underpinning. It's the strong material that goes underneath other things, all the horse harness you would want, so bridles and saddles. But of course, daily goods like shoes, belts, bags, everything was made out of leather. Some of it was covered, so leather itself was not particularly sought after. So if you were wealthy enough, you would have the leather covered by a rich fabric, but it was the leather that created the strength. So leather was an important core raw material for many, many different trades in the medieval period. And whilst tanneries were stinky, they were incredibly necessary. And people complain about them. We get lots of complaints in the record of tanneries and stenches and the flies. They were often downstream, they were often downwind, but of course, downwind for one town might be upwind for another, and downstream for one city is of course upstream for another. So you did your best, but you didn't want to really be living next door to a tannery if you could possibly avoid it, especially in the summer months. The stench could have been generally awful. What was human urine actually collected for? Well, mostly the cloth trade. The aged or matured urine was used to create a heavy ammonia kind of material, which is used for fulling cloth. Now, when wool is woven, it can be woven quite tightly and everything, but it's still got very obvious sort of warp and weft, the sort of threads and how they're tied together. To make really good cloth, to sort of batter it together, you need to full it, and that involves literally physical agitation, sometimes with hammers, sometimes those are water-powered hammers, sometimes just people standing there hitting it with hammers. But you would soak it in an ammonia solution. That ammonia solution was from aged urine. So the cloth was literally steeped in this pongy ammonia substance and taken out and battered over a surface to try and felt the material together, and it would create a much tighter cloth. And that was much sought after because it's warmer and it's more sort of integrated together. It's a sort of more solid cloth. So the aged urine would be very important. Now in the summer, I would imagine that aging would take a few days, maybe 4 or 5 days. I'm not quite sure. But it means that the urine is being collected as well every day, probably, and stored in barrels. You can't use the fresh urine. It's not stinky enough. It doesn't have enough ammonia in it. So you'd have to put it on one side. So if you went to a fulling factory, a fulling workshop, you would have lots of different barrels of variable quality, variable levels of maturity of human wee. Some of it was fresh and over the next few days would start to smell, but it's a process. You need tomorrow you need more aged urine. So yesterday's not quite aged enough urine, it's today's aged urine to use in the process for today. So there's a definite sort of time lapse there. So if you went there, you would see multiple barrels of human wee aging over time until they're ready to be used in the fulling process. The cloth is of course soaked in clean water and rinsed that way, so you wouldn't have any of the aged urine still in it, but they didn't have that much in the way of strong detergent. So I would imagine it's soaked as much as possible and rinsed as much as possible, but the cloth might still have a little bit of a pungent odour to begin with. It's going to get washed subsequently and things like that, but there's a possibility that it still retained a certain recognisable odour. Medieval towns actually had strong regulations about pouring your waste into the street. It was typically, people think of it as a medieval, people emptied their waste into the street in the morning, and that's just not true. There were very strong regulations. I mean, I suppose if you had regulations, then some people did it, but they were fined for doing it as well. And you don't want the street outside your house to have the contents of a chamber pot all over it. So I think it's very unlikely, although it certainly might have happened occasionally by people just missing the piss collector, for example, and needing to put the urine somewhere, maybe into the gutter surreptitiously. I don't think they were clean as such, but I don't think they were as utterly filthy as a lot of people imagine in popular culture. The contents of chamber pots is sometimes in the documentation called chamber lye, which I think emphasises its industrial use. It's not called piss or wee or whatever. It's actually called chamber lye in the writing. Obviously, perhaps somebody being a bit more polite with the words they choose to write down. But chamber lye was used in the fulling process. Now, a chamber pot is actually very practical. If you don't have central heating and you don't have an indoor toilet, which really doesn't come in until the 20th century for many people, and still most of the world doesn't actually have indoor plumbing. But having a chamber pot for your fluids at night is very practical. And I know that because I've used them many times. I've gone to reenactment events and the toilets are a long way across a very dark field that might be muddy, and it might have a lot of dew on the ground, and it's very wet. And last thing you want to do is get out of your warm bed and go to the toilet. And so use a chamber pot. It's incredibly convenient, and it means you can stay half asleep, as we all do when we've got to get up and go to the loo. You don't really want to wake up fully because you know you're going straight back to bed and you'll fall asleep again. So chamber pot's incredibly useful for that purpose. But always make sure the chamber pot is tucked back under the bed as well, because you don't want to get up in the morning and accidentally tip over your chamber pot. Don't ask me how I know that, but it's to be avoided. So chamber pot goes completely underneath your bed. And it's still actually incredibly useful today, especially if you are out and about in a medieval tent in a castle of a cold, an autumn night, for example. A thought has occurred to me. I haven't found any specific guilds to do with urine collection or processing. There's definitely guilds that became very powerful, the Gong farmers, the ones that dealt with solid human waste, but the actual fluids that humans produce, I haven't found a guild for that. I wonder if there ever was one, or whether it was not didn't become a guild as such. But that would be interesting. I wonder what they'd call themselves. It was obviously Gong farmers called themselves something euphemistic. So people collecting and managing human urine would probably want some kind of, I don't know, chamber lye arrangers, organisers, collectors, the collectors of, I don't know, there's lots of words that you might want to use for it, but I haven't found any reference to it at all. It's also likely that taverns were a big source of this. Now, we know that blacksmiths sometimes favoured certain types of urine. So, for example, the record says that quenching blades in the piss of a red-headed boy was to be preferred over anybody else's urine. Whether there's any truth to that, I don't know, but maybe there was, don't know. Maybe somebody's tested it out. Haven't got a clue. But taverns are obviously going to have a lot of people drinking ale. It's quite watery. They're going to be drinking the ale and they need to use the loo. They're going to go and wee in a barrel. That's going to be collected. Now, I wonder if taverns had special deals with the urine collectors. I'd like to think they probably did. They've got to get rid of it, and there's a lot of it, and it has a value. Now, the expression you've probably heard is so poor they don't have a pot to piss in. Now, as far as I could tell, that is entirely a 19th century invention. Sort of comes in around the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century even, and comes from America. So it doesn't represent, as far as I know, an expression that was medieval at all. But it's a shame because it's quite a nice one. It would indicate that you could sell your urine, but you can't sell the urine if you don't even have a pot. There is an expression about the steam off your piss as well, that something is not as lacking in value as the steam off your piss. And again, that's mentioned a couple of times in the late medieval period, but it's quite crude and is quite illustrative as well, and involves peeing outdoors and seeing the steam rising, and that's not having any value at all compared to the actual urine itself. And then obviously the expression to be pissed off with somebody is used widely even today. I'm not sure that has much to do with the urine trade in the medieval period. In summary then, the medieval period didn't really think about recycling in the way we might do today, when we live in an industrial society where there's a lot of stuff available all year round. A lot of it gets thrown away. There's lots of landfill. Things that would have value to a medieval person would just not be thrown away if they could possibly avoid it. We know that pots got broken and they got buried, and midden pits did exist, so they did throw some things away into the midden pit. But I think by and large, anything that could be reused would be reused. So your human waste, both solids and liquids, formed the underpinnings of food and one of the big trades. Dog muck was reused in tanning. I don't think medieval people really thought of themselves as environmentally conscious. They were a little bit aware about overfishing and eels, for example. There were laws about overfishing them, but I think that was more to do with controlling the supply for the nobility rather than being good to the environment. But of course, people lived embedded in the landscape. So it would be cold in winter. You didn't have central heating. You would have to use more fuel to stay warm, wear different clothes. Everybody was used to the annual cycle. The harvest was at a certain time, and temperatures were there. Winter was at a certain time, and everybody needed to behave differently in the winter. You needed to preserve your food. If you had a bad harvest, you would know you were going to be hungry for months until the next harvest. So it was very much closer to the landscape than we are perhaps today, certainly in the West. But I don't think they would have thought of themselves as ecologically conscious. But it was just the normal way of doing things. Your dung and your fluid waste were part of the cycle. They were part of the industrial process, not something just to be flushed away and given to other people. They had a value, and that value was to your local community.